Where do you think you're going?" Security guard Corny Smokes stepped out of the gatehouse, his hand already on his radio. Carl Lucas, CEO of TechVantage Solutions, worth $1.2 billion, rolled down his window, confused. "I'm going home. I live here." Corny's expression hardened. "Listen, buddy, I don't know what game you're playing, but this neighborhood doesn't allow your type. You needed to turn around right then." "Your type?" Those words hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Carl, maintaining his composure, reached for his wallet. "There must be some mistake. I'm Carl Lucas. I own 1247 Millionaires Row." He handed over his driver's license, his property deed, even his mortgage papers. Corny barely glanced at them before tossing them back through the window. "Nice try with the fake documents. But I wasn't born yesterday. You think you can just roll up here in some stolen car with forged papers?" The situation spiraled faster than Carl could process. Corny was already calling for backup, his voice crackling through the radio. "Yeah, we got a situation at the main gate. Possible trespasser refusing to leave. Might need police backup." Carl pulled out his phone and started recording. His voice remained eerily calm, but there was something in his tone that should have made anyone with half a brain stop and listen. "You have no idea who you're talking to." But Corny Smokes was about to find out. Before you hear what happened next, make sure you're subscribed, because this story was about to take a turn that would leave you questioning everything you think you know about power, justice, and revenge. And I want to know, have you ever witnessed discrimination happening right in front of you? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because what happened in the next 60 seconds didn't just change Carl Lucas's night. It changed the lives of everyone involved, exposed a conspiracy that went deeper than anyone imagined, and proved that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred isn't anger. It's strategy. What happened next changed everything for everyone involved. To understand why Carl Lucas remained so calm in that moment, you needed to know who he really was. This wasn't just some random wealthy man being harassed at a gate. This was a man who had clawed his way out of the Brewster Douglas housing projects in Detroit, where gunshots had been lullabies and hope had been a luxury most couldn't afford. Carl's mother, Patricia Lucas, worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. She cleaned offices at night, stocked shelves at dawn, and somehow still found time to drill one message into her son's head. "Baby, the world's gonna try to tell you what you can't do. You show them what you will do." At 17, Carl scored a full ride to Harvard Business School. Not because of connections or legacy admissions, but because he outworked everyone around him. While his classmates networked at country clubs, Carl was in the library until 3 a.m., studying market trends and building business models that his professors called revolutionary. 8 years ago, Carl started TechVantage Solutions in his 1-bedroom apartment in Cambridge. No investors, no startup capital, just a laptop and an idea that artificial intelligence could democratize access to financial services for underserved communities. Today, TechVantage is worth $14 billion and employs over 30,000 people across 6 continents. But here's what makes Carl Lucas different from every other tech billionaire you've heard of. His personal philosophy drives every business decision. Respect is earned through character, not demanded through fear. He's known in Silicon Valley as the CEO who remembers everyone's name, who promotes based on merit alone, and who has zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind. Which brings us to a detail that makes tonight's encounter even more explosive. 3 months ago, Carl Lucas quietly acquired Morrison Security Services as part of TechVantage's expansion into property management technology. The same Morrison Security Services that guards Millionaires Row. The same company that employs Corny Smokes. Now let's talk about what Millionaires Row had been. 47 mansions spread across 200 acres of manicured perfection in what was the most exclusive gated community in the state. The average home value had been $3.8 million. The average resident had been white, wealthy, and very particular about maintaining their community standards. The community had been managed by Whitfield Property Management, and their head of security had been none other than Corny Smokes. 15 years on the job, stellar reviews from residents, and what had appeared to be a spotless record. But if you had dug deeper into Morrison Securities' HR files, you would have found something interesting. 7 formal complaints had been filed against Corney over the past 3 years. All had involved incidents with minority visitors. All had been mysteriously buried in paperwork and never investigated. Here's what Corney Smokes hadn't known. Carl Lucas hadn't chosen Millionaires Row randomly. He had spent 6 months researching this community specifically because of these incidents. When the previous homeowner, tech mogul William Henderson, had recommended Carl for the property, he had also warned him, "Son, you're going to face some challenges there. Some folks haven't quite caught up to the 21st century, if you know what I mean." Carl had known exactly what he had meant, and that had been precisely why he had bought the house. His real motivation hadn't been just to live in luxury. It had been to create change from within the system, to be the catalyst that would expose the discrimination hiding behind manicured lawns and million-dollar gates. Back at the gate, the situation had been about to explode. Bobby Davies, Corney's partner, had arrived in a security golf cart, immediately sensing the tension. Bobby had been on the job for 2 years, and he had known Corney's reputation, even if management had chosen to ignore it. "Corney, what's going on here?" Bobby had asked, trying to de-escalate. But Corney had been too far gone, his voice rising with each word. "This guy's trying to scam his way into the community with fake papers, claims he owns the Henderson place." Carl, still recording, had spoken with unnerving calm. "I don't claim to own it. I do own it, and I also own Morrison's Security Services." Corney's laughter had been ugly and bitter. "Right? And I'm the President of the United States. No way some person like you owns anything here, let alone my company." Bobby Davies had felt his stomach drop. He had seen Corney get aggressive before, but never like this. Never so openly hostile. He had tried to intervene, but Corney had cut him off. "You back me up here, Bobby, or you can find yourself another job tomorrow." That had been when Carl Lucas had made one phone call that would change everything. "Misty, it's Carl. Execute Protocol 7 immediately." The line had gone quiet. Carl had slipped his phone back into his pocket and had done something that had unnerved Corney more than any threat could. He had waited, perfectly still, perfectly silent, the smile never leaving his face, because Carl Lucas had known something that Corney Smokes had been about to learn the hard way. Sometimes the most devastating weapon wasn't rage or violence. Sometimes it had been patience, preparation, and the power to completely destroy someone's world with a single phone call. And Protocol 7? That had been about to turn Corney Smokes' life upside down in ways he had never seen coming. 18 minutes after Carl had made that phone call, headlights had cut through the darkness. Not one car, but 4. Leading the convoy had been a silver Tesla Model S, and stepping out had been Misty Knight, Carl's executive assistant, flanked by 3 people in sharp business suits, TechVantage's legal team and the HR director of Morrison Security Services. Corney Smokes had squinted at the approaching group, his bravado finally starting to crack. "What is this, some kind of setup?" Carl's voice had remained steady, almost gentle. "Corney, I want you to meet my executive assistant, Misty Knight, along with our legal team. They're here to deliver some news." Misty had stepped forward, her voice crisp and professional. "Mr. Smokes, as of 11:47 p.m. tonight, your employment with Morrison Security Services has been terminated. Effective immediately." The words had hit Corney like a physical blow. "Terminated? You can't fire me. You don't even work here." Carl had finally stepped out of his Bentley, and for the first time that night, his smile had disappeared. "Actually, Corney, I can. Because 3 months ago, TechVantage Solutions acquired Morrison Security Services. I'm not just your neighbor, I'm your boss. Or rather, I was." The color had drained from Corney's face as the reality had begun to sink in. But Carl hadn't been finished. "You see, we launched a company-wide investigation 4 months ago using our AI-powered pattern recognition software. We analyzed complaint data, incident reports, and personnel files across all our security contracts. And your name, Corney, kept appearing in a very disturbing pattern." The HR director had opened a thick folder. 23 documented incidents over the past 3 years, Mr. Smokes, all involving minority visitors or residents, all somehow buried in paperwork and never properly investigated. Bobby Davies, who had been standing frozen in shock, had suddenly found his voice. 23. I filed 7 complaints myself about Corny's behavior. I was told they were being handled. Carl nodded grimly. Those complaints were never handled, Bobby. They were buried, just like the complaints from the Martinez family when Corny told them their realtor must have made a mistake bringing them to view the Johnson property. Just like when he told the Chen family that their pre-approval letter looked suspicious and maybe they should look elsewhere. Corny's hands had been shaking by then. This is insane. I was doing my job. I was protecting the community. Protecting it from what, exactly? Carl's voice had cut like ice. From successful families who happen to have more melanin in their skin. Before you find out just how deep this conspiracy had gone, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what we were about to uncover had shocked everyone to their core. And I want to know, how many times do you think incidents like this happen without anyone with power to do something about it, witnessing them? Drop your thoughts below. But here's where the story had taken a turn that nobody, not even Carl Lucas, had seen coming. The investigation that had started with Corny Smokes had uncovered something far more sinister than one racist security guard. It had exposed a systematic conspiracy that had reached into the highest levels of Whitfield Property Management itself. Linda Whitfield, the property manager who had been running Millionaires Row for 8 years, had been operating what could only have been described as a modern-day redlining scheme. Working directly with Morrison Security, she had been screening out minority buyers before they could even view properties. Here's how the scheme had worked. When minority families had contacted realtors about Millionaires Row properties, their information would somehow find its way to Linda Whitfield. She would then alert Morrison Security to flag these families as potential security risks or unsuitable for community standards. The financial incentive had been as disgusting as it had been effective. Corny Smokes had been receiving $5,000 bonuses for each successful deterrent, families who had decided not to purchase after being harassed or intimidated during property visits. Over 3 years, Corny had pocketed an extra $60,000 in blood money. Carl's voice had hardened as he had revealed the scope of the conspiracy. 12 qualified minority families, Corny. 12 families with perfect credit, legitimate pre-approvals, and dreams of owning homes in this community. 12 families that you and Linda Whitfield conspired to keep out. The legal team had stepped forward with more evidence. Video recordings, audio files, email chains that Bobby Davies had been secretly collecting for months, knowing something had been deeply wrong but having nowhere to turn. Mr. Davies, the HR director, had addressed Bobby directly. We found your whistleblower complaints. All 7 of them. We also found the retaliation you faced for filing them, including threats to your job and blocked advancement opportunities. Bobby's eyes had filled with tears of relief and vindication. I knew what was happening was wrong. I tried to report it through proper channels, but nothing ever happened. I started recording conversations because I was afraid for my job, but I couldn't stay silent. One of those recordings had been about to change everything. In it, Linda Whitfield's voice had been crystal clear as she had instructed Corny, "We can't be obvious about it, but we need to maintain the character of this community. Use your judgment about who belongs here and who doesn't. The Homeowners Association values your discretion, and they're willing to show their appreciation financially." Carl had looked directly at Corny, whose face had gone from red to pale gray. This isn't just discrimination, Corny. This is conspiracy to violate federal civil rights laws. This is housing discrimination. This is a federal crime. The weight of what had been happening had finally crashed down on Corny Smokes. His 15-year career, his reputation, his financial security, it had all been crumbling in real time. But more than that, he had been beginning to realize that this hadn't been just about losing a job. This had been about federal charges. This had been about prison time. And Carl Lucas? He had been just getting started. Because when you had systematically denied families their dreams based on the color of their skin, when you had profited from prejudice and hidden behind policies, you hadn't just faced personal consequences. You had faced the full weight of justice delivered by someone who had had the resources, the platform, and the determination to make sure the whole world knew exactly who you were and what you had done. The cascade had only just begun. What had happened next had been a masterclass in strategic justice that would leave you speechless. Carl's legal team hadn't wasted a single second. While Corny was still processing his termination, 3 separate lawsuits had hit the courts simultaneously at 6:47 a.m. The first had been wrongful termination and whistleblower retaliation on behalf of Bobby Davies and 6 other Morrison Security employees who had been silenced for reporting discrimination. The second had been federal civil rights violations against Morrison Security Services, Whitfield Property Management, and personally against Corny Smokes and Linda Whitfield. The third had been housing discrimination violations that could have resulted in millions in damages and federal oversight of the entire community. But Carl Lucas wasn't done. Not even close. By 7:30 a.m., local news crews had been pulling up to the gates of Millionaires Row. Carl had called them personally. Not through a PR firm, not through corporate communications, but directly from his phone while standing at the scene of the crime. Channel 7 news anchor Jennifer Walsh had been the first to arrive, followed by crews from 3 other stations and 2 online news platforms. Word had spread fast when a billionaire CEO had held an impromptu press conference about racism at his own front gate. Carl had positioned himself directly in front of the gatehouse where it all had happened, the morning sun casting long shadows across the scene. The irony hadn't been lost on anyone. He had still been technically locked out of his own community, but by then he had had the entire media watching. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carl had begun, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had built empires and destroyed obstacles. "What you're witnessing today is not just about one man's experience. It's about a systematic conspiracy to deny qualified families their right to equal housing opportunities based solely on the color of their skin." The cameras had captured every word as Carl had methodically laid out the evidence: the financial incentive scheme, the buried complaints, the coordinated discrimination that had kept 12 families from achieving their American dream. That had been when Corny Smokes had made the mistake of trying to interrupt. "This is all a misunderstanding," Corny had shouted from behind the gate, his voice cracking with desperation. "I was just doing my job. I didn't mean anything by it." The cameras had swiveled to capture Corny's face, red and sweating, as he had continued his damage control attempt. "Mr. Lucas, please, I have a family. I have kids. This is all being blown out of proportion. Can't we work something out?" Carl's response had been delivered with surgical precision. "Mr. Smokes, you told 12 families they didn't belong here because of their race. You pocketed $60,000 in bonuses for terrorizing innocent people. You looked me in the eye and called my property documents fake because you couldn't believe someone who looks like me could own something you couldn't afford. The only thing being blown out of proportion is the time it took for you to face consequences." But the most devastating moment had been yet to come. Carl's phone rang during the live broadcast. He had answered it on speaker for everyone to hear. "Mr. Lucas, this is Linda Whitfield. I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Perhaps we can discuss this privately." Carl's smile had been ice cold. "Miss Whitfield, you're on live television right now. The entire city is watching. Would you like to explain to these cameras how you've been running an illegal housing discrimination scheme?" The silence on the other end was deafening. When Linda finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I don't know what you're talking about." "Really? Because I have recordings of you instructing security to use their judgment about who belongs in this community. I have financial records showing bonus payments for successful deterrence. I have 12 families ready to testify about how they were intimidated and harassed under your direction." That had been when the reporters had started shouting questions. Linda Whitfield had hung up, but it had been too late. The damage had been done, broadcast live to hundreds of thousands of viewers, and streaming online to millions more. Within an hour, Whitfield Property Management's board of directors had made an emergency decision. Linda Whitfield was terminated immediately, and the company had announced they were conducting a full investigation into discriminatory practices across all their properties. Morrison Security Services, by then under TechVantage's ownership, had released a statement that Carl had read live on camera. Effective immediately, Morrison Security Services is implementing comprehensive policy overhaul, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees, and an independent oversight committee to review all discrimination complaints. We will not tolerate prejudice in any form. But perhaps the most telling moment had come when the residents of Millionaires Row had begun to emerge from their mansions. Some, like retired Judge Patricia Hammond and tech entrepreneur Michael Chen, had walked directly to Carl and shaken his hand in front of the cameras. "It's about time someone stood up to this," Judge Hammond had stated clearly. "We've suspected something was wrong for years, but we never had proof." Others, however, had stayed in their driveways, arms crossed, clearly uncomfortable with the media attention and the spotlight being shined on their exclusive community. Their body language had said everything about how they really had felt about Carl's presence and his actions. Real estate agent Maria Santos had approached the news crews with her own bombshell. "I'd been trying to show properties in this community for 3 years. Every time I brought qualified minority clients, something always went wrong. Sudden security concerns, paperwork issues, claims that the properties were no longer available. Now I know why." The press conference had become a rally. Bobby Davies had stepped forward to tell his story of repeated retaliation for trying to do the right thing. Other Morrison Security employees, emboldened by seeing their colleagues supported rather than punished, had begun sharing their own experiences of being pressured to discriminate. By noon, the story had been trending on social media. Millionaires Row scandal and Carl Lucas justice had been being shared thousands of times per minute. The video of Corny Smokes refusing Carl entry to his own home had gone viral, viewed over 2 million times in the first 6 hours. But for Carl Lucas, this hadn't been about viral fame or public vindication. This had been about systematic change. This had been about making sure that what had happened to those 12 families would never happen again, anywhere, to anyone. And as the cameras had continued rolling and the story had spread across the nation, one thing had become crystal clear. Carl Lucas hadn't just bought a house in Millionaires Row. He had bought the power to tear down the walls of discrimination and rebuild them with justice. The revolution had begun, and it had been broadcast live. 6 months later, the transformation had been nothing short of extraordinary. Morrison Security Services had become the gold standard for inclusive practices in the private security industry. What had once been a company plagued by discrimination complaints had become featured in Harvard Business School case studies as an example of how proper leadership and accountability could revolutionize corporate culture. The changes hadn't been just cosmetic. Every Morrison Security employee had undergone 40 hours of diversity and inclusion training. An independent oversight committee had reviewed all complaints within 72 hours. Most importantly, the company had implemented Carl's revolutionary Community First protocol, where security personnel had been trained to welcome and assist rather than intimidate and exclude. Bobby Davies had stood in his new corner office, looking out at the bustling Morrison Security headquarters. His promotion to regional director had come with a 40% salary increase and something even more valuable: the knowledge that his courage to speak up had helped transform an entire industry. He had overseen security operations for over 200 properties across 3 states, and his first mandate had been simple: zero tolerance for discrimination. Period. The hardest part wasn't filing those complaints, Bobby had reflected in a recent interview. The hardest part was watching good families get turned away and knowing I couldn't stop it. Now I make sure it never happens again. The consequences for those who had perpetrated the discrimination had been swift and severe. Corny Smokes had pled guilty to federal civil rights violations and conspiracy charges. He had been serving 18 months of federal supervised release, which had included 500 hours of community service at the Southern Poverty Law Center's Civil Rights Education Program. Every Saturday, the man who had once terrorized minority families had been helping teach children about equality and justice. Linda Whitfield's fall had been even more dramatic. Her real estate license had been permanently revoked, and she had been facing lawsuits from 14 different families totaling over $12 million. Whitfield Property Management had settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, but sources close to the case had suggested it had been enough to ensure she would never work in property management again. But perhaps the most powerful transformation had come from Carl Lucas himself. Using the settlement money from the civil rights lawsuits, Carl had established the Lucas Foundation for Equitable Housing, a $50 million scholarship fund specifically designed to help underrepresented communities enter careers in security, property management, and real estate. The foundation had already awarded scholarships to over 300 students, ensuring that the next generation of industry professionals would look like the communities they served. Revenge isn't about destroying your enemies, Carl had explained during the foundation's inaugural gala. Revenge is about making sure they can never hurt anyone else the way they hurt you. The most beautiful moment had come on a sunny Tuesday afternoon in spring. Carl had stood at his front gate, the same gate where Corny Smokes had once tried to deny him entry to his own home. But that time, he hadn't been arriving. He had been welcoming. The Rodriguez family had pulled up in their moving truck, at their 8-year-old daughter Sophia pressing her face against the window in wonder at their new neighborhood. Carlos Rodriguez, a first-generation American and successful engineer, had stepped out of the car with his wife Elena, a pediatric nurse, both of them still somewhat in disbelief that they had actually been there. "Welcome to Millionaires Row," Carl had said, extending his hand to Carlos. "I'm Carl Lucas, your neighbor 3 doors down." Sophia Rodriguez had run up to Carl with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Are you really a billionaire?" she had asked. Carl had knelt down to her level. "I am. But more importantly, I'm someone who believes that everyone deserves to live wherever they dream of living, as long as they work hard and treat people with respect." The new security guard, a young African-American woman named Michelle Torres, approached with a welcome packet and a genuine smile. She had been one of Bobby Davies's first hires under the new protocols, and she had treated every resident and visitor with the same level of professional courtesy. "The Rodriguez family is in Mansion 43, she had told Carl. "I've already given them the community handbook and the contact information for all the local services. Is there anything else you'd like me to help them with?" That had been what victory had looked like. Not just the downfall of those who had perpetrated discrimination, but the systematic rebuilding of institutions to serve everyone equally. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share with others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.